Hey guys, so pretty big discovery here. I did a bunch of measurements on the stock suspension on the Pioneer 1000, and it looks like there's a lot more travel to get out of the arms and the axles. Honda just went cheap on the shocks. So I ordered some RMAX shocks. They were supposed to come in like a week. Now Partzilla is saying they'll be here in November, whatever. I'm going to try to really get some crazy suspension travel out of this thing, and here's the numbers to back up what I think is possible. So it's a little bit of a long video, but it's very educational, so hang in there. I think you guys will find this useful, especially if you have a Pioneer 1000 and you want a smoother ride. Hey guys, today we were playing with the suspension on the 2022 Pioneer in preparation for doing a crazy shock swap. So we're going to measure the factory travel first, and the way to do that is make a mark on your fender, let the tape measure hang, so gravity will make it plumb, right? And then measure to that center hole on the stop spinning, the center hole in the axle shaft. So I'm gonna take all the measurements after because this is just a pain in the ass to hold the phone and do it. But basically I'm gonna measure what my droop is now, disconnect the shock, loosen up the 4 control arm bushings, and see what I get to with no shock hooked up. With almost every side-by-side suspension out there, maybe every single one of them, the shock controls down travel and up travel. So you can see this Pioneer's actually got a pretty good sized shock. It's 19, 20 inches long. So it's pretty serious. It doesn't look that much when it's sitting on the ground. It's got a lot of sag, but pretty beefy spring rate too. I'll give you some context. So it's definitely not like ATV sized. It's a good sized shock. This upper shock mount is pretty thin looking. I have to beef that up for sure. But anyway, so yeah, we're gonna see how much extra down travel we can get out of the suspension, and then see how much extra up travel we can get. To do that, I have to disassemble the shock, take the spring off, use the floor jack to push the arm all the way up and compress the shock, and then take some measurements there. And then we'll remove the shock and see what we can do. So basically we're gonna see how much more travel I can squeeze out of the stock arms, ball joints, and tie rods and CV axle before I have to do something crazy like put a double plunge axle or put higher angle tie rods or something like that. So we're just experimenting in preparation for the shocks that should come in next week. So there's the suspension at full droop. And the limiting factor is the CV axle. It's the inner cup is binding up. And let me show you how you can tell. So if you spin this axle, you can see the arm jump up and then fall back down. That is the shaft falling into the grooves in the cup. So the correct way to measure it is not when it's all the way down sitting in a groove, because if you do that, you're going to be grinding up your cups. And that's how a lot of the ATV lift kits for the four-wheelers are. They actually have the shaft contacting the cup. That's not good at all. Yeah, so what we're going to do is we're going to go till it finds a groove and sits all the way down, and then turn it till it comes up all the way. And then we'll go halfway between that. So I'm gonna call that full down travel and take a measurement. Now, if you look here, you're like, oh, it only dropped 3/4 of an inch. Well, that's 3/4 of an inch at the shock. There's a motion ratio involved here. So at the ball joint, it's a little more than that. This shock is actually mounted pretty close to the ball joint. So if we measure from the pivot point to the ball joint, you're at 16.5 inches. And the shock is 10.5 inches away. So you can see that if you did that motion ratio, 16 divided by 10, that's about 15 divided by 10 would be 1.5. So that's about 1.5. So basically, if it was 2 to 1, you know, if it was right in the middle, an inch here would be 2 inches here. Well, it's not. So an inch here is 1.5 inches here, 150%. So this puts the same mark on the fender. And now we're at 27 7/8. I think that's what that's reading. So that's an inch more down travel you can get out of this suspension system. I was kind of hoping for more, to be honest. This has 10.7 inches of front travel. The RMAX has 14 inches. So I really need to get at least another inch on the up travel side to make this worth it. And I'm probably gonna have to run limiting straps with these RMAX shocks based on what I just found here. All right, so I use my Death Trap spring compressor to disassemble the shock. And that's what it looks like at full up travel. So you can see it's got this big bump stop on here, and the shock body is contacting the bump stop. So that's full up travel. And if you look at it, the axle angle is straight. So that's why this thing doesn't have a ton of travel. They mounted the diff up pretty high to maximize your ground clearance. And because of that, all the CV axle travel is from straight to down. So what does that mean? Well, if you drop the differential down, you could get more travel out of it. Or if you let the wheel come up farther, you can get more travel out of it. Now, the question is, how much farther can you let the wheel come up before you have problems? I'm gonna throw the 27-inch tire on there. Actually, I'm gonna throw a Talon tire on there to get an idea of how much clearance there is if you let the wheel come up higher. When do you start having issues? But if you look at the ball joint angles, they're past 90, right? But the axle is not going to be the problem on up travel. So I'm going to take a measurement now, and we're going to see if Honda was honest about it having 10.7 inches of travel, I believe they said. About 27 at full down travel. Now we're at 18 3/4. And if you do the math, that's basically 27 minus 19, which gives you 8 inches of travel. So right now we're only getting 8 inches. So Honda's expecting this bump stop to compress down to nothing in their 10-inch calculation. And that's kind of what I expected. So I assume the RMAX is probably doing the same thing, where they're basically calculating the suspension travel with the bump stock removed. But still, I think we have some room for improvement here. What a difference. So without the shock, look how much higher it goes. Your angles, CV is almost like a straight line all the way across. So that's really interesting. So if you wanted to run some tiny tires on this and trim the bumper and the plastics out, which I'm not really opposed to doing, headlight will get in the way too, you could run a lot higher travel suspension on this. So what this means is I have to mount my RMAX shocks through the hood in order to utilize that up travel. So let's go ahead and take a measurement. This is going to be a huge difference. You also notice the suspension does sweep back a lot. Hold the tape measure with my knees. There we go. All right, so we're looking at about 12 3/8. I'll put all this in an Excel spreadsheet because I can't keep track of the numbers myself, but that's pretty significant. So there's as high as you can go with the factory 27 before it starts to rub. If you look at that axle angle, still a lot higher than factory. And if you were to steer right now, obviously it would rub, but this is just straight, so it's starting to touch right there. So what this tells me is I'm gonna need my hardcore forward raked arms when I install these shocks, because if I don't, I'm gonna waste some up travel. Those arms are gonna give me a lot more up travel. And of course, tire size is gonna take away suspension travel in this case, just like with most other cases. I think the rear is gonna be a little bit easier because it's more open in the rear. Also new for 2022, these are Talon style upper spherical joints. And you can tell that because I tightened them down and the suspension still travels really smoothly. The bottom ones are the older school Honda rubber compliance bushings that add some resistance. So this is good for long travel suspension. All right guys, so I know everything outside was a little confusing, so hopefully these make more sense all on one page. This is just the front suspension. I'll do another sheet for the rear suspension. Okay, so this is all front suspension. Stock down travel was around 27 inches from the fender to the axle center line. All of these measurements are from that green mark on the fender to the axle center line. So that's stock down travel. Max down travel, with the shock removed and the suspension bushings loose, I got 28. So that's an increase of 1.1 inches of down travel. Pretty significant. I was hoping for 2 inches. Up travel though, that's the big difference. So what we learned is that this thing has very limited up travel. Stock up travel was 18.75 inches. Max up travel was 12.4 inches. That's a difference of 6.35 inches of travel. That's huge. Insane. Okay. And then I put a 27-inch tire on there, and I went to the max up travel where that starts to rub, and that was 13.9 inches. But that's still an increase of up travel of 4.85 inches. So what do all these numbers mean? So the stock travel, if you look at this formula, it's just subtracting these two numbers, was 8.15 inches. Honda says it's 10.7. That's because they're saying if the bump stop was compressed down to nothing, that's how much travel you would have. And that's how a lot of companies measure suspension. I think Toyota does that too. But realistically, unless you're really nailing the bump stop, you're not getting much more than 8.5 inches of travel. So that's stock. Max tire size, or max travel, ignoring your tire clearance and just saying, I'm going to cut all the plastics off this thing. I'm going to put some forward arms and I'm going to let it eat. You could get 15.6 inches of travel out of the stock CV joints if you really wanted to max it out. Yes, your shocks would be sticking through the hood in order to accomplish that. I'm fine putting shocks through the hood. Plastics are cheap. That's probably what I'm going to do. Now, if you wanted to make sure the 27 didn't rub on your stock plastics without bringing the A-arms forward, you can still get 14.1 inches of travel. And that's what the RMAX has in the front. So I think this is going to be pretty huge. I'm going to add a lot of up travel, which is going to keep this thing from having those hard bottom outs when you try to cross a washout or a ditch or whatever. So let's go ahead and fact check myself. So what is going on here with this number? If we click on this, this is your max down travel minus your max up travel. That's pretty simple. But this should also equal my deltas. So it should equal this plus this plus the stock travel. Oh, look at that. So with enough clearance for a 27-inch tire, we're at 12 3/4 inches. Here's your max up travel without worrying about tire clearance and no shock installed, obviously. And you're at 10 3/4. Jeez, that's impressive. Okay, let's go to full droop. Video that while it comes down. It's pretty sweet. This droops down really far. Let's make sure it's sitting where the axle's happy. So full down travel, measuring from the same point on the bed, 27 inches. That is sweet. And that's with the axle happy. It's not sitting in a bind. Yeah, there's some bad angle on it, but the axle shaft is not contacting the cups. Let's give you a comparison of the angle. This is stock down travel. We're at 24 inches. At stock up travel, just barely compressing the bump stop, and we're at 16.5. All right, guys, so here's the rear numbers. Same chart format, just for the rear. So max down travel with the stock shock, you get to 24 inches. Without the shock, 27 inches. So a 3-inch delta there. There's 3 inches of lift. Really nice on the rear. That made me happy. Stock up travel was 16.5 inches from the fender. Max up travel was 10.75. This is actually probably more like, I'm going to call this 10 because I could get a little bit more out of it if I wanted to remove the sway bar. So that'll be more accurate. So about 6.5 inches more travel on the upside in the rear. Huge. And then up travel with a 27-inch tire installed. I installed the tire, got it to rub, removed the tire, measured it, 12.75. So what do those deltas mean? So 3 inches more down travel, 6.5 inches more up travel is available out of the suspension with a better shock and better shock mounting. And then if you want to use clear 27-inch tire without cutting a hole in your bed, which I'm not really opposed to, the bed's plenty big enough to have some tires stuffed through it, we could get another 3 3/4 inches of up travel. So stock travel, not compressing the bump stops too much, we're at 7.5. If you go over to this sheet, you see it's a little bit less than the front, which makes sense because Honda says it has 10 and the front has 10.7. And then if we ignore tire clearance and we just really max it out, you can get 17 inches of travel out of this rear suspension. And my little check over here works, so that's good. And then if we want to not rub with the 27 too badly, we can get 14.25. So what this tells me is that if I max out this suspension, I can get just as much travel out of it as an RMAX. Pretty awesome. So RMAX Sport, these are actually the shocks I bought. Chassis. Yeah, 14.2 in the front, 16.9 in the rear, so let's call that 14.17. and we're going to get 17 in the rear if I really max this out, and we can get 14 in the front pretty easily. So realistically, I'm not going to get the full 17 in the rear, because I want to keep my bed somewhat practical and not have tires stuck all the way through it. So I'll probably shoot for like 14 in the rear and then 14 in the front. And the way I'm going to have to do that is by manipulating the geometry of how I mount the RMAX shocks and also using limiting straps. But pretty excited that there's this much extra travel available.